This is Analogous Propinquity. I'm Paul Baker, along with Dr. Jim Bowers and Arnie Rothschild, who is the executive director of the Broadway Theater League, as well as political consultant, mass media mogul. What other kinds of accolades could I give you, Arnie?
Renaissance man.
Oldest in the room.
There you go.
Yeah.
But he looks the youngest.
There you go. You still trying to get back from that one, aren't you, Bowers?
I'm still trying to get back into Arnie.
Which is another story completely. But we are off to the races once again in this episode as we look at a comparison, an analogy, if you would, between harness racing and politics. Arnie has a good amount of experience in both. One of the things I wanted to bring up early on in this particular episode, because we're going to get a little bit closer into some of the elements here, one of which is picking the horse, the first thing I wanted to talk about. One of the things that I guess I never realized before is that when you're talking about harness racing, you're not talking about thoroughbreds, you're talking about standard breds.
That would be correct.
So what's the difference? Because a horse is a horse, of course, unless...
So
it's Mr. Ed, but...
Back in the day, farmers used to come into a central area and bring their best trotting horse, and they would race against other farmers. In fact, in the city of Rochester, Driving Park was a harness track, and also where Vic Park A and Vic Park B are, that was a harness track. And when you're on Park Avenue, there's kind of a little bend in Park Avenue. That was the turn on the harness track. So that the farmers would come in to meet to race their trotters. And as harness racing evolved, there were two kinds of gaits. One were trotters, which is a natural gait for all horses. The other are called pacers, and pacers move both right legs at the same time, both left legs at the same time. They're called sidewinders. They came out of logging camps with rough terrain, and that's the way they were able to skip over the terrain. So there are both kinds of horses, and eventually they were timed to a time standard to be determined to be of sound physical attributes to become breeding properties. But the natural gait is the trotter, and trotters are the harder to shoe and get balanced and the more natural. And pacers are faster but more mechanical, and their legs are connected with what are called hobbles to make them stay on gait with both right legs moving together and left legs moving together.
Okay, question. Because you guys know more than I do, even though I have the PhD. I'm willing to admit that I'm narrow. Anyway, thoroughbred, standard. Is standard the nice way of saying that these horses are mutts?
Not at all.
I'm being serious.
Yeah,
I'm not being flippant.
All horses are actually mutts.
Okay.
So there's a different. So the standard breds were less inbred from one line, if that's what you mean. They're part Persian, they were part quarter horse, but they were bred for a very specific kind of thing. They were actually workhorses. And unlike thoroughbreds, whose only function was to run, these were actually workhorses that came in off the farm, or carriage horses, and then they would race.
Okay.
And as the physical characteristics began to get inbred more and more and more, they have become a pure breed, but they, depending on what part of the world, so for example, in Australia, there was a higher incidence of Persian in them. But there are no horses that are really pure. Thoroughbreds were part Arabians.
Well, because the reason I appreciate the answer, but I was actually hoping I was right, because I like the thought of being able to refer to all political candidates as mutts.
Well, that...
As opposed to son of a bitches. But I like the idea that...
Or both and, I mean...
Both and.
In today's environment, there is a wide range of the nature of people that run for office for all different reasons, and not the least of which is ego.
Okay, now to play with this then for a second, so the thoroughbred is trained for a specific thing, to run.
Correct.
So is it, to take the other side of that analogy, candidates, particularly those who continually pursue an office and go from one office even to the other, or stay in one office an extended period of time seeking re-election, can we speak then that in effect they've bred themselves
Oh, absolutely.
to be a thoroughbred like a horse?
No, absolutely. There are people who from the very beginning of their, many of them in military service, just their focus was totally to be candidates. John Kerry comes to mind, that everything that John Kerry did during the Vietnam era was to prepare himself to run for public office. The John Kennedys of the world,
George H.W. Bush.
Mitt Romney, so there, yes, George H.W. Bush and W.
And there again, there's a pedigree.
Yep.
That's working there in some cases. The Kennedys, the Bushes, these are the Romneys even.
Romneys, yeah. So there are some people who believe that their destiny was to lead in government. Whether that is a good or bad thing. But that was the direction they took. There are still others who come to this because they believe they want to be public servants. There are others who go the judicial route because they feel as though their expertise in the law is meaningful. But in no small part, the vast majority of the people that I've met in and around the political business are sadly very self-serving. A lot of them want to be in the state pension system. A lot of them want to be in various pension systems. A lot of them have failed in business. One of the things, I did a congressional race the first time that I worked with Tom Reed when he ran for Congress. And we did a little survey, and in that period of time, the members of the House of Representatives, there were only 12 who would ever sign the front of a paycheck as opposed to the back of a paycheck. And so, in trying to talk to them about what it's like to operate a business, they had no frame of reference.
Well, why in the world would you leave a successful business if you're a good businessman and go into Congress when you can buy a congressman?
That's a good point. But just to back up a second, for the listener outside the area, Tom Reed, now former congressman.
Correct.
Southern tier of
Southern
New York?
tier, yeah,
Southern
right.
tier of New York.
Correct.
Just wanted to add that for a little bit of...
And a distinguished career. I mean,
Yeah.
Tom was a member
Mayor.
of the Problem Solvers group.
Right.
Problem Solvers Caucus, correct. He was the co-chair, but it was the southern tier of New York. The interesting thing about and not to get in geography, but across the bottom part of New York State, those are primarily conservative counties with the exception of Tompkins County, which is where Cornell and Ithaca College are, which is extremely liberal. So you had, last I looked, 8 counties that were very conservative and 1 county that was very liberal. But, those lines have been redrawn. But that was a seat that was occupied by a man named Amo Houghton for years. But, if you think about what it was that I was saying that's problematic, we are mid-debate as we record this about what to do with a debt crisis and debt limits. And some members of government are talking about one thing, and those others with business acumen are talking about another thing. And therein lies the problem, is that to try to build consensus when you don't have a frame of reference of business friendly. It was really great post-COVID to throw a lot of programs out to prime the pump, if you will. The problem is there was never a plan to pay for those programs. So now we keep mounting debt, which is going to be, over the next number of months, the greatest debate we're going to have nationally.
Yeah. And then to kind of even bring that back full circle to what we're talking about, in terms of campaigns. Then there's the people who are handling the default, simply trying to score political points in saying we must have this or that. So there's a real mix going on.
Yep.
Now, and let me throw in, and we can discuss this and disagree if you'd like, but I think the other element in this is the voting public, which honestly, as long as the subway is running, as long as I got hot water when I hit the tap and electricity when I turn on the light, and inflation is always a problem, but it ain't that bad,
Well,
that voter is going to lose interest in this conversation very quickly as long as the trains are running.
right, and here, even I can give you a personal example of self-interest on this one. I'm going to be really pissed off. Now, remember, I'm going to be really pissed off if my Social Security check doesn't come in because of a default.
Well, and that's the point, Jim.
That's the point. I know. That's why
that is where the general public cares. It's in my backyard. As long as it's NIMBY, as long as it's not in my backyard, I don't really care.
This was the argument of the Jeffersonians versus Hamiltonians from the get-go, which was that people were never going to take the time to understand the issues. Hamilton, didn't believe, as Jefferson did, that and it led to the House of Representatives versus Senate, by the way, but the Hamilton believed that people were going to take the time to educate themselves, and he was an elitist, and Jefferson believed that that this should be a pure democracy, and there was an argument. But the thing that is fascinating to me is how little people pay attention. I would tell you that when I do a New York State Supreme Court race, doing strategy, there are a number of people who think it's the United States Supreme Court. When I do a New York State Senate race, there are a number of people that believe it is the Senate of the United States. And you do a congressional race, and there are a number of people that think that that's the United States Senate as well. So, no one ever went broke in politics underestimating how people are paying attention. They don't. The first thing we do is we look at reinforcing our own belief. And the key to winning elections is you're not going to move a hard Republican from their position or a hard Democrat from their position. You have to be able to preempt the middle, which is going to be the true discipline of running elections moving forward. And in so doing, we're going to have to abandon a lot of principles that typically have driven how you run elections.
Well,
I'd like to get back on that to picking the pony then, because you got horses that are pacers, you got horses that are trotters, you've got tracks that run fast, you've got tracks that run slow, depending on where you're running, what the conditions are. When you're picking that horse, what are you looking for? And are you looking for a horse that's not too fast out of the gate, not too slow?
Ideally, you're looking to do what we do when we train horses. You are looking to bring horses along through races that are not as competitive. So you'd like to start in a local race and then perhaps move them to a countywide legislative body and then maybe a statewide legislative body and then eventually a congressional. So ideally, you'd like to move them up as they acquire a skill set that allows them to understand how to articulate the positions that allow them to win. Now, there's an interesting thing, and coming back to the horse stuff, right? The biggest problem with candidates is candidates, all of whom see the things or hear the things that are important to them. With a horse in a race, if they are listening to the other horses around them too much, you plug their ears. If the horses see better straight behind them than they do ahead of them. So some of them, you put what's called a can't see back bridle that just takes away directly behind them. And then if they're still looking around, you put a blind bridle on them. And so what ends up happening is, and I've said this to candidates all the time, I just want you looking down the racetrack. I don't want you looking at the other horses. I don't want you seeing everybody's lawn sign. I don't want you hearing your relatives talking to you about what you should be doing from a policy point of view. And so there's an amount of candidate management, but that starts with, what are the weaknesses of the candidate? Do I need to plug their ears? Do I need to take vision away? Do I need to limit them?
You're off social media, Fred.
Yeah, limit them. You ask them not to watch social media. There are so many times where all of a sudden you plotted a course to win an election, and the candidate will get diverted by something that they think is important.
Well, and in a general way, and then I also have a question for you. The last time I ran for public office was 2007. I ran for the East Side City Council seat in Rochester. And in retrospect, I had good people around me. I had Paul. I had a really good team. I was getting some assistance from the late Steve Manerick, who, even though I was a Democrat, as he says, Jim, I like smart office holders. I don't think that's always true, but in Steve's case. But anyway, here's the problem. Having taught this stuff for years, having been an analyst for years, I thought I knew a lot. And I was a poor candidate in some ways that really needed to have the blinders put on, have the ears plugged, and probably a gag. I mean, I'm just being honest. So I know what you mean. And I kind of did an article where I kind of did an analysis of the campaign afterwards, and I was a terrible candidate in retrospect.
So
even though I know a lot about this stuff.
If you're driving or riding a horse, you don't just throw the reins at them and let them decide how they want to run the race. What they'll do is they'll run themselves out. Everything in this process is a sequence of events that you have to control. So there are some candidates that you're running as outsiders. It's a lot like running a horse who's a stretch runner. What you have to do with an outsider is you have to close faster than anybody expects so that you are building momentum near the end. If you've got an incumbent, it's like racing a horse on the front end. What you try to do is bust out of the gate, grab the lead, and control the pace of the race. So, when I've said to people over the years that this is a lot like training and racing horses, it is, because you always start with strengths and weaknesses, and you have to begin to manage both. And how you do it depends on what the horse needs, as opposed to the way that you did the last election.
Because this ties into what we're talking about. So I want to go back to something you said earlier about, more and more having to focus on the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So staying with these analogies, is the voter and particular voter groups like the middle, and I'm thinking particularly nowadays, professional women, college-educated women, depending upon where you are, the race, and so forth, are they the track, or are they a condition of the track, like a muddy track, rainy track? You see what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, so
they are a condition.
They're the condition.
Yeah, and what ends up happening is that not only are they a condition, they are overstated in their simplicity many times. In the election of 2016, exit polls showed that 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump, even though all the way through the polling didn't show that. But exit polls showed that 53% did. And we categorize things unfairly. Let me go back to this just in a national election context, okay? All of us are already seeing national polls on the presidential election. We don't have a national election for president.
Right. No, and again, a reminder, listener, we are not even halfway through 2023, and it's been months that we've been talking about 2024. In fact, we've been talking about 2024 since January of 2021.
Yeah. I constantly and I think it's amused. I think that's the right way to explain it. So we talk about the matchup between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, Governor DeSantis and Joe Biden. But no one ever says, okay, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Florida, here's those matchup numbers. Those would be the only things that would be meaningful.
Yeah. A couple of things real quick. In case the listener is hearing what appears to sound like a ship's horn or some other kind of horn, let us take a second and let you know that we are coming to you from downtown Fairport, New York, which sits on the Erie Canal, and we believe at the moment some boat of some sort is going through the canal. So every so often as we record here, you may hear an interesting honking horn-like sound.
From the studios of Bill Moran Productions in Packett's Landing, this is Analogous Propinquity.
Yes, where wit and wisdom meet at a crossroads.
Wherever.
Actually, I have a follow-up for him. So when we're talking about those polls, so what's interesting these days, I think, too, and we've touched on this a little bit, I think, in the last episode, but the polls, you could say, are kind of predicting the conditions of the track within reason. What are women doing? What are men doing? What are, and I was listening, I saw a poll the other day, again, allowing that we're only in the beginning. It was an ABC poll, and they were going all apeshit crazy about this because it was a poll of a national sample that showed Trump beating Biden like 47 to 42 or something. But the point is, when you see that it said random sample of people as opposed to
Likely voters.
Right. And not to mention the other prejudices that could be in there, landlines, age, and so forth, that the polls, if you're thinking about trying to handicap a race and get the bet spread, what should we be betting? The polls are increasingly a terrible indicator of the track conditions.
I don't believe in polls anymore. I do focus groups. In 2016, by the way, there was one poll that had the election right all the way, and that was the LA Times, because it was a re-interview of the same people over a period of time as opposed to a whole new random sample. And so they were able to track movement. But back to polling in its current construct, the reason, so back in the day, when you had 3 digits, you had wired phones, the first 3 digits were the broad geography in which you lived. The 4th digit was assigned to streets of like property values. You could build a geographic model, and then you were trying to fill model. But then the first thing that changed was you could take your phone wherever you moved. And the second thing that changed, we converted to cell phones. So now you're trying to screen to try to get to a sample. I would promise you that as a higher percentage of people carry cell phones, a higher percentage of people will not answer a number that they don't recognize. And this is especially true with all minority populations. So that part is harder to fill. And so,
So we're getting a self-selecting sample at the end.
And a lot of it is shifted over to automated polling, where you're getting about 2%, 2.5% return rates. So you have to launch 40,000 phone calls to get anything. So the polling, as we knew it and began to accept it as meaningful, has now changed dramatically.
So maybe we'd actually be better off letting the gamblers or whoever sets the bets and things.
The odds makers.
The odds maker, thank you. The odds maker. Maybe we better listen to more of them than we do the pollsters.
The first thing is the difference between when you see RV in a poll, registered voter,
right,
and LV in a poll, likely voter. And I don't look at anything that isn't a likely voter poll.
Exactly.
I would tell you this is, and the other thing is you have to understand what it is you're looking for. And this was something else where the media did a terrible job in 2016. So let's say that we're in the state of Ohio. We are 2 weeks out from the election. In 2016, Hillary Clinton looked like the incumbent. Donald Trump looked like the challenger. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now from within 2 weeks, and if the incumbent has not broken 50, then I take a look at the undecided voter, and they will break 2/3, 1/3 to the challenger, because if the incumbent hasn't put away the race, then there's a reason why. So using that logic with likely voting polling, 2 nights before the election of 2016, I did my own electoral map, saying, okay, if she hasn't broken 50 here, I'm going to do 2/3 Trump, 1/3 Hillary Clinton. I was wrong by one state, and that was Michigan, where 200,000 African Americans didn't vote in the Detroit area. My point is, the media did a terrible job at presenting what we operatives, if you will, know, and that's how polling works. So, they put out numbers as if they're gospel, as opposed to saying, well, here's what may happen with the undecideds.
And here again, the media has a bad habit of treating politics as a horse race.
Yes, yep, absolutely correct.
And all horses are not equal, and all track conditions are not equal. And as we're discussing and learning, there are a lot of things that need to be considered as we go into this. As far as a winning horse, what is a winning horse?
A winning horse is a horse that allows you to move them in the course of the race as you have to move them.
I want to take this a step further, Arnie, because we call ourselves Analogous Propinquity, so I'm going to go down the analogous part of this again. And we're using a sports analogy, a sporting analogy. I want to move sports for a minute. I want to go to baseball, and I want to say that Ohtani's got a 286 batting average. Harper's got a 280 batting average. Judge has got a 283 batting average. Now, if I'm looking at percentages, I'm not thinking that 28% is really all that great. And yet, Bryce Harper and Mike Judge, we're talking 28% of the time, they strike out. Now, let's talk football. Josh Allen, 62.3 completion record. Tom Brady, 63.9. Here's the surprise. Aaron Rodgers, 65.3. And they call Brady the GOAT. Even there, less than 2/3 of the time, these guys aren't connecting.
By the way, the GOAT is Peyton Manning. End of discussion on that. Go ahead, Arnie.
A good political strategist, and they're different if they come from the Republican side or the Democratic side. And let me just explain that before I make my statement. Remembering that we're recording this in New York State.
Right.
So if I do a New York State assembly race, for example, I know I'm going to get outspent 2 or 3 to 1. So a good Republican strategist working in New York State, if they can win 3/4 of their races, they're doing a great job, because they're always going to get outspent. On the congressional side, it is totally a subset of how the district's been gerrymandered, but all in all, to your point, Paul, in races where I'm able to control variables, like in a judicial race, I should be able to win 95% of the time. In situations where I can't control some variables, or where I've got a slow horse. So there was a race in New York City where at first they knocked the Democrat off the ballot, the incumbent, and the Republicans had a doorman who had agreed to become a candidate, and all of a sudden he's running against a woman who has to run a write-in campaign. That's a race that you never think is going to happen that way. And by the way, the doorman lost, because there are when you have overwhelming registration difference, there is not anything you can do. In that one, 92% was Democrat registration. So there's a lot of variables. And the truth is, and this gets to be a more important point, you don't play where you're not competitive. You don't play where you're not competitive. In Rochester, New York, in Syracuse, New York, in Albany, New York, in the cities, in New York City, you wonder why you don't see a lot of Republican candidates, and the reason is they can't win, and why would you bring out vote from those geographies when you have countywide races that exist at the same time?
I just want to tweak Paul's winning candidate to likely winning, is what I think. The second part was, and yes, while there are, we'll go back to the analogy, while on any given day there's multiple horse races, in elections, what you just pointed out is there's multiple races going on at the same time, but each race can affect the other race.
Can impact the others.
I mean, it's again, the analogy doesn't fit entirely, but it's like multi-level horse racing at one time.
And there is a philosophy. You either think that the key to winning the race is throw all the assets that, you need the most money to win the race, or you need the best strategy to win the race. And I would tell you that the reason that the election business is so strategist-driven is that left to their own device, candidates will lose, and right strategy wins, assuming that you can convert enough of that middle to give you a margin, which is one vote more than half.
This is Analogous Propinquity. Dr. Jim Bowers and Paul Baker with Arnie Rothschild talking about the horses and politics. Next time, we continue. The race is on.